On June 12, 2005, Steve Jobs, the founder and former CEO of Apple, gave the most viral 15-minute commencement speech of all time.
You've got to find what you love, and that is as true for work as it is for your lovers. Your work is going to fill a large part of your life, and the only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is great work. And the only way to do great work is to love what you do.
In this speech, he highlights 3 stories that changed his life and also publicly shares his journey with pancreatic cancer. This speech has been watched over 50 million times, and in this video, we'll be looking at what makes this speech so special. Our goal is to not only to listen, but also to learn from this speech. Without further ado, let's hop into the conversation.
I'm honored to be with you today for your commencement from one of the finest universities in the world. Truth be told, I never graduated from college, and this is the closest I've ever gotten to a college graduation. Today, I want to tell you 3 stories from my life. That's it. No big deal. Just 3 stories. The first story is about connecting the dots.
Before we get into the stories, let's look at how he started. First off, he says, I didn't graduate from college. Almost like, hey, I'm a little intimidated by you all. Be sure to give me some slack. The second thing, he says, all I want to do is share with you 3 stories. That's it, nothing more. Immediately, you're hooked. You want to know the stories because we are storytelling creatures. We understand life through stories, birth, death, starting school, graduating school, getting your first job, ending your first job, and then being able to sit down and hear from the person who founded Apple.
I dropped out of Reed College after the first 6 months, but then stayed around as a drop-in for another 18 months or so before I really quit. I didn't have a dorm room, so I slept on the floor in friends' rooms. I returned Coke bottles for the 5-cent deposits to buy food with. And I would walk the 7 miles across town every Sunday night to get one good meal a week at the Hare Krishna temple. I loved it. And much of what I stumbled into by following my curiosity and intuition turned out to be priceless later on. Let me give you one example. Reed College at that time offered perhaps the best calligraphy instruction in the country. Throughout the campus, every poster, every label on every drawer was beautifully hand calligraphed. Because I had dropped out and didn't have to take the normal classes, I decided to take a calligraphy class to learn how to do this. I learned about serif and sans serif typefaces, about varying the amount of space between different letter combinations, about what makes great typography great. It was beautiful, historical, artistically subtle in a way that science can't capture, and I found it fascinating. None of this had even a hope of any practical application in my life. But 10 years later, when we were designing the first Macintosh computer, it all came back to me. And we designed it all into the Mac. It was the first computer with beautiful typography. If I had never dropped in on that single course in college, the Mac would have never had multiple typefaces or proportionally spaced fonts. And since Windows just copied the Mac, it's likely that no personal computer would have them.
And this is the structure of his speech. He starts with the origin story, sets up the relatability, and then shares a narrative. And then after the narrative, he shares takeaways that apply to the audience, and then he launches into the next narrative. But throughout these narratives, he infuses humor, and he infuses this reminiscent nature to it so that as an audience, we feel like we were there, reliving his life. But this also sets up some really cool one-liners and bits of wisdom. I'll show you.
Of course, it was impossible to connect the dots looking forward when I was in college, but it was very, very clear looking backwards 10 years later. Again, you can't connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. You have to trust in something, your gut, destiny, life, karma, whatever, because believing that the dots will connect down the road will give you the confidence to follow your heart even when it leads you off the well-worn path, and that will make all the difference.
That is such a powerful takeaway, and it gives me chills whenever I hear it. One, because his pacing is so consistent and reliable. The second is because he set up a story so the audience trusts that he knows, because he's been through it. And now, this big successful person, but he's saying, hey, I had no clue what was going on. But as we look back, the dots are connected. And he urges his audience to have faith that the dots will connect, because you can't connect them looking backward, rather only forward. And the structure makes it possible. The story, then the takeaway. Let's see the next one.
My second story is about love and loss. I was lucky. I found what I loved to do early in life. Woz and I started Apple in my parents' garage when I was 20. We worked hard, and in 10 years, Apple had grown from just the two of us in a garage into a $2 billion company with over 4,000 employees. We just released our finest creation, the Macintosh, a year earlier, and I just turned 30. And then I got fired. How can you get fired from a company you started? Well, as Apple grew, we hired someone who I thought was very talented.
And then he throws a curveball. So the predictable thing would have been hearing the first story about how it took him a while to get started, but ultimately he did get started, and now they've been crushing it ever since. But rather, he creates this company that's incredibly successful, and then he gets fired from his own company. The structure of the story is highly engaging. One, because it's incredibly unique. We're all very curious about Steve Jobs. Two, it's a roller coaster. We know he somehow ends up here, but we weren't expecting him to go like this. And the third reason it's so good is because we're wondering what's next. So let's see.
I'm convinced that the only thing that kept me going was that I loved what I did. You've got to find what you love. And that is as true for work as it is for your lovers. Your work is going to fill a large part of your life. And the only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is great work. And the only way to do great work is to love what you do. If you haven't found it yet, keep looking and don't settle. As with all matters of the heart, you'll know when you find it. And like any great relationship, it just gets better and better as the years roll on. So keep looking. Don't settle.
Simple, 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 simple. He's not using these words that are super big or hard to understand. He's not coming at us with technical concepts that we need a 10-year career at Apple to understand. Don't settle. Keep looking. It gets better and better as the years roll on. Sometimes life will hit you like a brick. Very easy to process, very easy to understand, and his consistent pacing just lets those words sit. And then he pauses. Right here he says,
Looking, don't settle.
and the audience starts applauding.
My third story.
13-second pause. Keep looking, don't settle. Now I wait for 13 seconds, right? One thing we haven't mentioned is he looks down a lot, which some would say, hey, he's not making eye contact with his audience. Typically, it's great to make eye contact with the audience, and honestly, you'd rather look at them in the eyes than look down with whatever you're looking at. But the way that he established the beginning of his speech gives him the freedom to look down, yet still have trust and relatability with his audience. One, we know he's sharing stories. Two, we know that these takeaways are really important. So as an audience member, you're okay with him looking down. And it's a really good nuance. It's a really good example of how sometimes all of these roles don't use filler words. Well, Barack Obama uses filler words. He's still a really good speaker. Don't use really long, complex words. Well, Donald Trump uses some really simple words, yet he's a really effective speaker. And then here, don't look down at your notes. Well, Steve Jobs is doing it. And this speech has almost 50 million views on YouTube, and it's one of the most renowned commencement speeches in history.
My third story is about death. When I was 17, I read a quote that went something like, if you live each day as if it was your last, someday you'll most certainly be right. It made an impression on me. And since then, for the past 33 years, I've looked in the mirror every morning and asked myself, if today were the last day of my life, would I want to do what I am about to do today? And whenever the answer has been no for too many days in a row, I know I need to change something. Remembering that I'll be dead soon is the most important tool I've ever encountered to help me make the big choices in life. Because almost everything, all external expectations, all pride, all fear of embarrassment or failure, these things just fall away in the face of death, leaving only what is truly important.
This is one of the strongest persuasive appeals, appealing to the finite nature of life. He is instilling that feeling into his audience, and they're about to graduate. So he's helping them approach their future like how he approached his future whenever he recognized that life is finite. And this is a really valuable message and a really valuable perspective to pass on.
About a year ago, I was diagnosed with cancer. I had a scan at 7:30 in the morning, and it clearly showed a tumor on my pancreas. I didn't even know what a pancreas was. The doctors told me this was almost certainly a type of cancer that is incurable, and that I should expect to live no longer than 3 to 6 months. My doctor advised me to go home and get my affairs in order, which is doctor's code for prepare to die. It means to try and tell your kids everything you thought you'd have the next 10 years to tell them in just a few months. It means to make sure everything is buttoned up so that it will be as easy as possible for your family. It means to say your goodbyes.
And he presents his cancer diagnosis in a really interesting way. He uses this repetition structure. He says, whenever my doctor advised me to go home and take my affairs in order, this means that you need to make sure everything's buttoned up. It means that you need to say your goodbye. It means that you need to tell your kids everything you thought you'd have to in the next 10 years to tell them. This structure, this repetition, it sits in our heads. Boom, 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 as we process.
Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. Don't be trapped by dogma, which is living with the results of other people's thinking. Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice. And most important, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow already know what you truly want to become. Everything else is secondary.
That'll get you to run through a wall. Again, it's a story and it's a takeaway, a story and a takeaway, a story and a takeaway. Have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. He's saying, hey, I met death face to face this year, and it made me realize that this message is important. So I'm telling you all, as you're graduating, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition, because everything else is secondary. Stay hungry, stay foolish. This address is a perfect example. If you want to make an impact, you don't have to have the biggest words. You don't have to have technical concepts. You don't have to come up with stuff that no one's ever heard before. Rather, if you show up with a little humor, you show up with relatable stories, and you pace yourself and give some takeaways from each of these stories, you can make an impact that's going to last well beyond you. This speech is one of my favorite speeches. I remember listening to it in college and memorizing that have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow already know what you truly want to become. It's set with me. And now, as you all go speak, be it conversation, a phone call, or maybe you get to do a commencement address, remember, don't pressure yourself to come up with big words or come up with fancy concepts. Speak simply, share stories, and share some practical takeaways. Steve Jobs is a really fascinating person. We have a ton of fascinating people on this channel. Subscribe if you like communication content. Go ahead and watch the one I just did over Obama. And without further ado, I'll see you next time.